we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Lord, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to strengthen our hope, that we might stand in the face of the storms of life with the courage and the promise and the treasure. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here, for I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Can you thank Grace's dad for that composition from 2 Corinthians chapter 4? I asked Pastor Kevin Hedges to put that passage to music, and that's what he came up with, and I liked that a lot. This year, 2018, I will turn 62 years old, and it is creeping me out big time. And I know there are some of you here who are going, 62, I got bunions older than you, boy. You're just a youngin'. And then I know there's others of you that are going, you're only 62, man. You've been rode hard and put up wet. You got a lot of miles on you, buddy, if you're just now turning 62. But I really am uncomfortable even saying that. I'm really wrestling with this 62 thing. And there's two reasons why I'm uncomfortable with it. And it's not because I'm afraid of it. It's not because I'm ashamed of it. It's primarily because I'm confused by it. I mean, I thought by the time I got all the way to 62 years old, man, I'd have things sorted out. I'd have it all locked down. And what I'm finding is the more I learn, the less I know. The older I get, the fewer the hills that I'm willing to die on. My perspective is broadening and stretching and changing in ways that I never anticipated. I thought by 62, I'd just be on a curmudgeon on my front porch with a stick going, hey, you kids, get off my lawn. And I don't feel that way at all. I thought at 62, I would say, we've had a good run. Time to put your feet up. And right now, I just feel like I'm just finding my stride. Like I'm just sorting out the things that are most important in life. And I realize I'm a slow learner, but I'm right in the thick of it. And I didn't expect that, and I'm confused by that. But there's a second thing that troubles me about turning 62, and that's something that happened 31 years ago. 31 years ago, I got a call from my mom. We were living in Dallas at the time. My parents were in Pennsylvania, and my mom called me and said, your father's been diagnosed with stomach cancer. He's going in for some tests, and we'll know in a week or so what the prognosis is. Some of you have been there when someone throws the C word down on your life, and you have to wait. And you know that when they say, we're going to give some tests, and it could come out this way and be okay, and come out this way and it'd be bad. Well, the test came back and it was bad. And the stomach cancer had spread to his kidneys and to his liver, and And it was an aggressive form of cancer. And so they said, we're going to do some more tests and see what our options are. And so we waited another week, and that news came back, and that was bad. All of the options were bad. They said, we're going to do some more tests, we're going to look at things, and we came to another crossroads. And I don't remember the succession of those days, but I remember the last call where they called and they said, well, the doctor said to get your things in order. You don't have much time. We will put together a protocol for chemotherapy and radiation. We'll do some surgical procedures, but really we're not optimistic. You have about a 10% chance of surviving the year. I remember when I got that call, we were living in Dallas, we were a young family, and we didn't have the money to drive down to the airport and get on a plane and fly to Pennsylvania, so I asked my brother-in-law if he would drive with me. And so we drove the 1,500 miles door to door from my house to our farm in 18 hours. We didn't fly in a plane, we flew in a car. But we got there because we were all pretty sure this was the beginning of the end. So my father entered into that year without any health problems at all, and all of a sudden we were looking at an uncertain future. He entered into that year with a full head of hair, and the hair that he didn't pass on to me. But through the process of surgical treatments and chemotherapy and radiation, over the course of the next year, he lost about 1/3 of his body weight and all of his hair and wound up looking like this, like me. But he survived. In January, my father celebrated his 93rd birthday. But the thing that has haunted me for 31 years was that he was diagnosed with cancer when he turned 62. I know some of you are familiar with that. Some of you have had parents who have died while you were in your youth or while you were a young adult, and you kind of made a mental note of that age when the cancer crept into your family, or the heart disease, or there was trauma. And it's a haunting reminder of the thing that we don't like to think about, the thing that we avoid talking about, the thing that we live in denial about, and that is our own mortality. It is a marker in the future that says the clock is ticking, the sand is falling through the hourglass. You don't have forever, and it's a reminder of that, and we don't like it. 2 weeks ago, we began a conversation about our bodies. I mean, we've often had conversations in church about caring for our souls, but how does God want us to care for our bodies? How does God see our physical bodies? We know how God sees our heart and sees our eternal value in our soul, but how does God see us as physical beings? And how should we see ourselves? How should we measure and evaluate our physical self? And how should we measure and evaluate the physical selves of those around us? And so we began a conversation a few weeks ago with the idea that the first thing we need to do if we want to see ourselves physically as God sees us is we need to see ourselves as this marvel of biomechanical engineering, this unprecedented design in all of the universe, that even when our bodies are decaying or deformed or traumatized, they are still marvels, unparalleled in the universe in their capacity. Our ability to process speech, to process vision, to process sound waves, to move about freely, to feed ourselves, to think, all of these complex systems are a wonder. And if we want to see ourselves as God sees us, we begin by recognizing that we and everyone we meet is a marvel of God's design. And to be in awe of the fact that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And we start to recalibrate our perspective of what beauty is and what is valuable in a human form when we see the intricacy and the majesty of God's design. Last week we talked about the idea that these bodies that we have are a responsibility, that we have a stewardship. We often think of caring for our souls as a priority, but so is caring for our body, because the two are connected. We need to care for our physical body in the same way we care for our spiritual body. We need to be both physically and spiritually disciplined. Because a person who only cares for their own body and nothing for their soul is no worse off than a person who only cares for their soul and completely disregards their physical body. The two go together. And it's an important stewardship, and to see ourselves as God sees us, sees our bodies, our physical life as valuable. And we are to be good stewards of it. But today, I want to ask the hard question. Why are we so frail? Why is the world so bent on destroying us? Why is life so brutal? Why is it that God created this marvelous miracle of biomechanical engineering and set it on a planet that is destined to destroy us? Because there is none of us who will get out of this life alive. Why is it that we spend the first half of our life getting our stuff together and the second half of our life trying to remember where we put it? Why does life unfold with such a traumatic end? Why is life so unfair and harsh and brutal? And why are these mortal frames so frail and fragile and vulnerable? I don't want to just ask that question today. Today I want to try to answer that question. And the answer I want to share with you is not an answer that will appeal to many of you. Some of you will say that's too abstract, that's not helpful, but I know there are some people here today who need this. Because they're down for the count. They're holding on by a thread. Their physical prospects and the struggle of this life has worn them down, and they don't know if they can go on another day. And there is an answer. The answer comes to us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. The Apostle Paul, reflecting on our physical bodies, says in 2 Corinthians 4:7, we have this treasure in jars of clay to know that the all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We have this treasure in jars of clay. This all-surpassing power is part of who we are. But what is it? What is this treasure? What is this all-surpassing power? What is this thing that is in all of us? Because it is. This all-surpassing power, this treasure, is part of the image of God that is invested in all of us. And we see it all the time, we just don't recognize it. He goes on to describe what it looks like. What is the evidence of this treasure? He says, when we are pressed in on every side, when everyone is against us, when our friends betray us, when the world turns its back on us, when we are pressed in on every side, we are not crushed. It's evidence of the treasure. When we are perplexed, when we are confused, when we are discouraged, when we are riddled with doubt, we are not in despair because of the treasure. When we are persecuted, when we are unjustly accused, when we are betrayed, when we are prejudicially mocked, when we are marginalized, we are not abandoned because of the treasure. When we are struck down, when we are face down on the canvas, when we cannot take another step, when we are truly defeated and exhausted, we are not destroyed because of the treasure. But what is this treasure? We know it when we see it. I promise you, you know it when you see it. You may not know what it is, but you know it. I knew what it was when I saw it on July the 23rd, 1989. July 23rd, 1989 was the last day of the 76th running of the Tour de France bike race. You know what the Tour de France race is? They hold it every year. It's over 20 or 21 days, and it covers most of the nation of France and some of the surrounding countries. In 1989, the 76th running of the Tour de France ended in Paris on July 23rd, 1989. The favorite to win the Tour de France that year was the two-time champion and Frenchman, Laurent Fignon. Laurent Fignon was expected to dominate the Tour in 1989. But there was a man who was chasing him back and forth. They competed for the contents, and it was a man who was a former champion. He had been the first American to ever win the Tour de France in 1986. He came out of nowhere. His name was Greg LeMond. He was the world champion and the Tour de France champion in 1986. And in 1987, he was accidentally shot in a hunting accident. He had shotgun pellets lodged in his lung and in his heart. And not only did the doctors think that he would not physically survive the accident, they were confident that he would never race professionally again. Because of the tremendous exertion and the aerobic stress that racing in the Tour de France requires, and the elite level of physical conditioning that you have to attain to compete to win that race, they said a man who was virtually dead cannot come back and win this race. But here they were, July 23rd, 1989, in the final stage, a time trial through the streets of Paris, 15.5 miles. In the reverse order of their time, the last two riders were LeMond and Fignon. LeMond trailed Laurent Fignon by 50 seconds. The time trial was 15.5 miles, and at the professional cycling level, if you were able in that level of competition to make up maybe a second a mile, maybe 2 seconds a mile on your competition, you would have had the best ride of your life, and he was 50 seconds behind with 15.5 miles left. No one gave him a chance. They had literally given him up for dead. They were ready to give the maillot jaune to Laurent Fignon. And then Greg LeMond did this.
And the final yards. He will clearly have the fastest time of all the cyclists today.
The seesaw battle through the Tour between these two men. First LeMond led, then Fignon, then LeMond again, then Fignon, and now who?
Laurent Fignon approaches the Arc de Triomphe. The key time is 27:47. If he's slower than that, the yellow jersey is lost.
And LeMond's time represented an average speed of 34 miles an hour. No Tour de France time trial has ever been quicker.
At the finish, Greg LeMond listens to French radio analyze the numbers. He still is not sure if he was fast enough. Fignon now just over 2 football fields from the finish line, and still, Greg LeMond doesn't know which way the closest Tour de France in history is going to go. The magic time is gone, 27:47. And that means the yellow jersey for Laurent Fignon has been lost.
Greg LeMond won the 1989 Tour de France, a race over 21 days, 2,041 miles, by 8 seconds. I remember watching that on ABC's Wide World of Sports, and I completely lost my mind. It was one of the greatest physical accomplishments that I had ever seen. Not only was it because he was an American, it was because he was a man who was given up for dead just 2 years before. He was a man who on that very day was not given a chance at winning, and yet he did. From somewhere deep inside of him, he pulled out a strength that was superhuman in its capacity, and he reached out for a victory in the midst of the promise of defeat. This is the treasure. This is what Paul is describing in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 in verses 8 and 9, when he says that we are pressed in on every side, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. He's describing that spirit that we all see when someone rises up against the odds, when someone who is marginalized or undervalued seizes the day, when a person shows superhuman determination to stand against the tide and against adversity. When we see that, what we are seeing is the treasure. We are seeing the trace evidence of the treasure that is in us. But make no mistake, this is not a human treasure. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, the Apostle Paul says we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God, but not from us. Because the treasure is the power of the hope of the resurrection. It is not the strength of our will. It is not the determination of our character. It is the superhuman gift of the hope that nothing will ever defeat us because his life has defeated death. It is the hope of the resurrection that is our treasure. And we see the trace evidence of it every time we see someone stand against the tide, every time we see someone push back against their foes or get up from the mat when they were counted as out. We see the trace evidence of the hope of the resurrection. We have to get theological for a minute to understand how the Apostle Paul makes this case, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, the Apostle Paul says, here's how you know that what is in you is the hope of the resurrection. He says in 2 Corinthians 4:10, for we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. Oh, what? Thanks for not helping us at all, Apostle Paul. What do you mean we carry around the death of? Does that mean we have to wear like a 9-pound crucifix around our neck or carry a cross? Or we have to act like we're dying? We have to walk around going, oh, you're killing me all the time. What does it mean that we carry around in our body the death of Jesus? It's so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. Okay, we didn't really understand that, Paul. He says, okay. Well, let me repeat myself and tell you a second time what I mean. He says, for as long as we are alive, we are constantly being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life I'm either right on it or way off track right now. We're going to go with right on it, okay? He's basically saying we're constantly given over to death so that his life may be revealed in our body. What he's saying is, that's what this world is. We are constantly living under the threat of death. We are constantly walking in the valley of the shadow of death. We are constantly living. We are born with the idea that this will not end well. To quote a friend of mine, death always wins. None of us get out of this life alive. And for such a reason, we should have no hope. Life should be a futile effort. Because whether you live 5 years or 50 years or 150 years, it all ends the same way. But he's saying, no, that is not what is going on. We are being given over to death all the time so that his life can be revealed in our mortal bodies. As long as we are alive and we stand up against the tide and we push back against the discouragement, and we rise up from the ashes and we pull ourselves off of the canvas, we are saying, we are not defeated. We are not done. This is the hope of the resurrection. This is the treasure that is in us. It is the treasure that transforms us, that changes us. He says in verse 12, so then death is at work in us. And I don't like the word and there as a conjunction. It should be so then. Death is at work in us so that life can be at work in you. We see the trace evidence of this all the time. We see the trace evidence of the power of the resurrection when we hear those stories. Those stories of the underdog, the stories of the overlooked, the story of the one who everyone counted out. That's why we love Star Wars. We love Star Wars because it's the story of the underdogs. It's the story of the rebel Jedi. Do you remember the first Star Wars where Han Solo says to him, "I'm done with you, I'm out." And then when Luke is trying to blow up the Death Star, Han Solo swoops in, "Go get him, bud." And we're all like, "Yeah! We thought you laughed, but you're here, you're our hero. Because you came back from the dead. We had counted you out and you returned." And something in our soul resonates about that. That's why we love Rocky. And because he goes, I have two turtles, I have Cuff and Link. There's my dog Buckus, my dog Dick Buckus. Yo, Adrian. That's why we love Rocky, because it's the underdog story. We love Rudy. We love Nick Foles because it's the underdog story. Because it's the person who everyone said, no, they can't do it, and then they do. And what we are experiencing in those moments is the trace evidence of the hope of the resurrection. Because every time your feet hit the floor in the morning and you say, I will get up and I will face whatever comes at me this day, you are living a resurrected life. We are living a life based on that treasure that is held in these jars of clay. But make no mistake about it. We do this to know that this surpassing power is not from us, but from God. That we will not be defeated, not because of the strength of our will, not because of the quantity of our character, but because of the hope of the life of one who defeated death. This should change us. This should transform us. And it should transform the people around us. You know, the interesting thing about what happened 31 years ago with my father was that it changed him. I mean, when I was growing up, my father, to be polite, was a nominal Christian. We kind of had a laissez-faire Christianity. We went to church on Christmas and Easter. There was a church down the road from our family farm that our family had gone to for generations, and we would show up there once in a while and put in an appearance. But my father's faith was passive at best. He was a borderline agnostic, and when he found out that I wanted to change my career path and go into the ministry, it drove a wedge between us. For the better part of 12 years, we had countless arguments and disagreements. It got to the point where when we would come in from Dallas to the farm in Pennsylvania, my mother prohibited us, my father and I, from talking about religion, because we always get into an argument. But a year after the doctor said he was in remission, I sat in that little community church down the road from our farm, and I watched my father stand up and testify to all of his friends and neighbors that it was their prayers and it was the power of God that saw him through. And I've watched him grow in his faith in the 31 years since that time, because when he was fighting for his life is when he found his hope. Because the hope of the resurrection is fashioned in the valley of the shadow of death. This is why. This is the why. Why is life so hard? Why is the challenge so great? Why is the struggle so relentless? Why does it end so badly? So that we might cling to a hope that is undefeated. That we might treasure that all-surpassing power that is within us. And so that when we are knocked down, we will get up and we will not abandon the fight, and we will push back against the tide, and we will not go quietly into that good night. This is where our strength of character comes from a hope that is undefeated. This is why. It's not a pleasant answer. It's not an answer that solves all of the problems. But if we lived our life and said, I will live and I will suffer and I will struggle and I will die and that's all there is, then what would be the point? It is a hope that sustains us in a world that abuses us, in a world that destroys us. It's a difficult thing for some of us to understand, but I know that here today, there are some people who need to know that. Because someone's laid the C word on you, and someone has told you that your future is not good. There are some of you who have wounds that are fresh and pain that is real. And you need to know that there is a hope that is undefeated. And it is a hope that is hidden in that treasure, in that jar of clay, in us. The hope of the resurrection. And so I would invite you today to immerse yourself in that hope, to find in the challenges of life, the brutality of it, the cruelty of it, the injustices of it, to find in this jar of clay that treasure. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you.